Is the Associate Professor of Religion in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at Spelman College. She received her PhD from Harvard University, MDiv from Emory, and MA and BA from Ewha Women's University in Seoul, Korea. And let me see here. She currently serves as co-chair for Women in Religion section at the American Academy of Religion. Dr. Kim's research interests meet at the intersections of feminist theology, feminist theory, Asian and Asian Pacific North American religious and theological studies, transnational studies, and world Christianity. Some of the topics Dr. Kim is currently exploring include the politics of sex, gender, sexuality, and the other in the discourse of the Protestant right in South Korea, and implications and significance of engaging quote, Afro-Black Orientalism in interdisciplinary religious theological studies on post-coloniality, neo-imperialism, Americanness, and gendered racial formations. In 2011, she received Presidential Award for Teaching Excellence at Spelman College, and her publications include Collaborative Dissonance, Gender and Theology in Asia, Pacific America, Transformative Moves to Join a Transnational Feminist Pedagogical Practices, Celebrating Feminist Birthdays, Bringing Filiative and Affiliative Together, and the one I really found very helpful to my own research interest was Engaging Afro-Black Orientalism, a Proposal, in Journal of Race, Ethnicity, and Religion. And thank you for coming this afternoon, and I'd like to just turn it over to Dr. Kim.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. It is my honor and privilege to share my work with you today. And I would like to offer my sincere thanks to the Asian and Asian American Center for Ministry at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary and Dr. Enjo for providing me this wonderful opportunity. And I also would like to thank you who are in the audience this afternoon. I know it's getting dark, but you are here, so I appreciate that. Without further ado, I will proceed with my presentation entitled A Vision to the Graveyard of Empires, the Challenges of Missions in and from the Global South. This presentation is based on two of my articles, one already published and the other forthcoming. There's one caveat that I would like to share before proceeding. While acknowledging that the term evangelicalism, evangelicals, and conservatives cannot be used with easy generalizations, and there are evangelical Christians who are not politically conservative, I use the term evangelical Protestant Christians interchangeably with theologically and politically conservative Christians in this particular presentation. The news of my PowerPoint is not working exactly the way it should be, so I apologize for that. The news of the kidnapping of 23 South Korean Christians by the Taliban on July 19, 2007 stunned not only Christians in South Korea, but also much of the whole nation and the world. 23 members of the Spelman Church were on a 10-day mission trip to Afghanistan. Shortly after the news of kidnapping broke out, Spelman Church, a Presbyterian church located in a new middle-class suburb of Seoul, issued a statement that 23 kidnapped members of the church had traveled to Afghanistan to do voluntary relief work, such as providing medical aid and teaching English. The senior pastor of the Spelman Church denied that their trip was a religious mission. Over the course of the 43-day hostage situation, the captors killed two of the kidnapped men before negotiations before the Taliban and South Korean government reached a settlement. On August 29th, the 21 surviving hostages were finally released and returned to South Korea. South Korean government negotiations with the Taliban, of which full term was not disclosed to the public, left behind unverified rumors and hearsay, such as paying the ransom to the Taliban. During the hostage situation, and even after the survivors returned from Afghanistan, Quite a few number of individuals, concerned organizations, and groups of people in South Korea engaged in fierce debates and discussions on the incident through blogs, public forums, and media. In most cases, criticisms and resentment was directed toward the kidnapped Koreans for their heedlessness, 샘물 Church's violation of South Koreans' restrictions on travel to dangerous regions, including war-torn regions such as Afghanistan. Korean Protestant churches' overzealous mission activities, as well as irresponsible mission methods and strategy that are inconsiderate and insensitive to other churches. And finally, weak South Korean government that was compelled by unequal power relations with the United States to send troops to Afghanistan as an ally, which some South Koreans believe to be the direct cause of the kidnapping. Despite some sympathetic Christians' attempts to defend the kidnapped missionaries for their dedication by honoring the two killed missionaries as Christian martyrs and saints, anti-Christian sentiment and stern criticisms persisted among non-Christians and some Christians alike. Since the hostage crisis took place in summer 2007, South Korean government banned both civilian aid work and missionary work by its citizens in Afghanistan and evacuated most remaining South Korean civilians from Afghanistan. The U.S. House of Representatives voted to spend $96.7 billion more for the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq in May 2009. On December 1st, 2009, U.S. President Barack Obama announced that he was going to send 30,000 more troops to Afghanistan by the summer 2010. South Korean government has also decided to dispatch 320 troops to Afghanistan. In the meantime, South Korean churches have been busy re-examining and revamping their mission methods, goals, and strategies. Today's talk is to look at how contemporary evangelical overseas missions in and from the global South are imbricated with U.S. neocolonialism underpinned by its military hegemony in light of the South Korean mission fiasco in Afghanistan in summer 2007. So the whole trend of missions, both long-term and short-term, in the global South will not be necessarily addressed in this talk today. Drawing from transnational studies, I situate the 2007 South Korean missionary hostage case within the transnational social field of evangelical Christians. I also situate this incident within the context of world Christianity, for contemporary evangelical missions in and from the global South signify an indispensable part of world Christianity. Drawing from Katie Cannon's missiologic of imminent parousia and theologic of racialized normativity, I will also talk about the common biblical, theological, and cultural references in which transnational connections among evangelical Christians are rooted in order to illuminate how contemporary evangelical missions are involved in U.S. neocolonialism underpinned by U.S. militarism. Finally, instead of proposing alternative forms of mission, I will look at the ways in which the 2007 South Korean Evangelical Mission in Afghanistan reveal wittingly or unwittingly cracks, ambiguities, and contradictions in the U.S. imperialist military interventions in places like Afghanistan, a region once called the graveyard of empires. So what is transnational social field? Transnational social field is a concept coined by French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu that calls attention to the ways in which power shapes social relationships. Transnational studies scholar Nina Glick-Schuller expands the boundaries of the social field beyond national borders, calling it a transnational social field. According to Glick-Schuller, a transnational social field refers to a network of networks that stretch across the borders of nation-states. Transnational social fields include corporate organizations and networks, non-governmental organizations and networks, and religious organizations and networks. Evangelical Christians who have formed transnational connections beyond the boundaries of their nation states through various organizations and networks are also members and actors of the transnational social field of evangelical Christians. For instance, evangelical Christians who have formed a new faith-based movement in the United States, Korean evangelical Christians both in South Korea and Korean diaspora, various mission organizations and networks such as World Evangelical Alliance that represents 420 million evangelicals around the world, the International Cooperation Mission Agency, which helped arrange the Senmul Church's mission trip to Afghanistan in 2007, are all integral parts of the transnational social field of evangelical Christians. This view of the transnational social field of evangelical Christians help us understand the South Korean hostage incident as more than just a discrete case of Korean Christianity. Although there may be a difference in degree given that South Korea has become the second largest country sending missionaries abroad, next only to the United States, the hostage incident is symptomatic of the contemporary evangelical overseas missions, of which connections are rooted in common biblical, cultural, and theological references. So for example, International Cooperation Mission Agency, founded by Paul Choi, is leading the Back to Jerusalem movement. Okay, why it's not showing? Okay, I'll just leave it here. Back to Jerusalem movement, inspired by a movement by the same name that began in the early 1940s in China in the hopes of sending missionaries back to Jerusalem along the historic Silk Road. The regions targeted by Back to Jerusalem are mostly overlapped with the areas encompassed by the 1040 window and popularized by the 80-2000 and beyond movement. The 1040 window was coined by Argentina-born Louis Bush in 1990. The 1040 window refers to the regions located between 10 degrees and 40 degrees north latitudes, which include about 62 countries. I don't think it's showing. Okay. I had a map for 1040 windows that shows the areas that encompassed by this movement. But so about 62 countries with about 4 billion people, emboldened by the biblical passages such as Matthew 24:14, Matthew 28 verses 18 through 20, and Acts chapter 1 verse 8, missions to the regions in the 1040 window have been viewed as an urgent task by many evangelical Christians. These regions are called the places where the unreached people groups dwell. Most of the unreached people groups refer to Hindus, Muslims, Buddhists, and people with indigenous religions, who are also referred to as spiritually impoverished souls. Despite some critical voices against them, both the Back to Jerusalem movement and the 1040 window are now popular mission themes and slogans, and they have gained a great momentum and followers among evangelical Christians, including Christians in South Korea and Korean Christian communities in diaspora. Many evangelical immigrant Korean churches and some other Asian American churches in the US have also been sending missionaries, both long-term and short-term, either independently or collaborating with mission groups internationally, to various countries in Asia as well as Central and Latin America, providing financial aid and human resources to local churches they have planted. In his reflection on the South Korean missionary hostage crisis, Sung Chan-ra, an evangelical theologian, also maintains that Korean churches follow the patterns of U.S. evangelical church, that is, quote, materialistic, consumeristic approach to church growth and missions, close quote. Thus, it is simplistic to view the hostage incident in Afghanistan simply as the result of misguided and ill-prepared mission strategies of once-grown Korean Christianity. Instead, we must take into account the larger evangelical missions in relation to U.S. neocolonialism, the geopolitical and theological significance of Islamic countries and other unreached regions as Christian mission fields, and transnational mobilization of evangelical Christians. It is no news that Christianity is one of the fastest growing religions in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, or what is now commonly called the Global South or the majority world. Timothy Shaw notes that it is, quote, the explosive growth of the evangelicalism in the third world that is transforming global religious demography and casting new doubt on conventional assumptions about the North's leadership vis-a-vis the transnational body of Christ, close quote. Lamin Saneh, prominent scholar of mission studies and world Christianity, foresees that churches in South Korea will play, quote, a key role on the new Christian frontier about to open in China, which might well become a dominant axis of the religion with hard to imagine implications for the rest of the world, close quote. Saneh has also noted that while the number of mainline Protestant missionaries is decreasing, evangelical missionary members are, quote, increasing steadily, complemented by a rising tide of African, Asian, and other third world missionaries, including more than 10,000 from South Korea alone, close quote. Although scholars agree that Christianity has grown rapidly in the Global South, they argue about whether to define Christianity in the Global South as a global Christianity or a world Christianity, and how the future of Christianity will appear. Debating about the terminology that describes the characteristics of Christianity in the Global South as well as a future of Christianity seems to revolve around more than just nomenclature. Regarding this matter, I agree with both Saneh's and Peter Phan's critiques of Philip Jenkins' thesis of Christianity in the Global South as a new Christendom, and his description of various features of global Christianity. However, I also diverge from Saneh's and Phan's position by contesting that heterogeneous Christianity in the Global South defies the simple binary of indigenous versus Western influenced, progressive versus fundamentalist, anti-neocolonial versus neocolonial, and so forth. Certainly, there have been indigenous responses to the gospel, as Saneh and Phan have agreed and argued, and some local responses have been critical of the colonialist mission agenda as well as universal theological claims, while other Christian churches support securing new colonial systems and maintain transnational connections and networks with fundamentalist Christian churches in the United States. As Manuel Vasquez and Marie Marquette have demonstrated in their study of the globalization of religion across the Americas, the indigenization of Pentecostalism in Latin America coexists with the transnational form of Pentecostalism. This taxonomy of the local responses to Christianity in the Global South surely requires further examination to better understand the potentials as well as the limitations of these forms of Christianity in determining the future of Christianity. By drawing attention to the transnational processes and connections that contemporary Christian organizations and networks make across the borders of nation-states, it becomes clear that they are not so easily categorized. Moreover, there have been increasing cases of so-called reverse missions from the Global South to the Global North. For instance, Saneh has observed that, quote, increasingly and in growing numbers, third world churches are appearing in the towns and cities of the West, while third world missionaries are also arriving to serve in churches in Europe and North America, close quote. The important thing is that we need to look first at the various complex relationships between Christianity in the Global South and Global North, since one of the characteristics of world Christianity is heterogeneity. Thus, it is not productive to argue that world Christianity is unequivocally different from Western Christianity or even global Christianity. It is also naive and reductionist to say that fundamentalistic Christian organizations and networks in the United States control or manipulate Christian churches of the Global South. Equally problematic is to paint evangelical Christianity of the global South as an indigenous movement unrelated to evangelicalism in the United States or other parts of the world, free from neo-colonial structures of power. In other words, critical reflection and multifaceted analysis are needed of the heterogeneous Christian responses of the global South. While world Christianity departs from the Christianity of the old Christendom, world Christianity is not necessarily free from the neo-colonialism that perpetuates inequality among people either. Rather, world Christianity is deeply enmeshed within the current neo-colonial systems and operations of power. A deeper question then is, to what extent Christian missions, especially the growing evangelical missions of the churches of the global South, participate in reinforcing neo-colonial realities or resisting them? While scholars have agreed and come to understand the 19th century Western overseas missionary movement in a more complex way in relation to Western colonialism, we have not discussed much the dynamics of contemporary missions, especially the relationship between the contemporary evangelical missions in and from the global South and neo-colonialism. If the 19th century Christian overseas missions needed to be understood within the context of Western colonialism, whether they had directly supported the colonialist projects or not, then it seems necessary that 21st century evangelical missions in and from the global South should be examined in relation to neo-colonialism, because mission, as George Rieger argues, is now shaped by neo-colonial realities whose dark side is often overlooked. Neo-colonialism is a new manifestation of imperial domination after formal colonialism ended by the anti-colonial resistance and independence movements around the world. Neo-colonialism is found in what feminist scholar Anne McClintock calls the United States imperialism without colonists, that has taken a number of distinct forms, some concealed, some half-concealed. As an integral part of U.S. imperial dominance, neo-colonialism has always been inextricably related to U.S. militarism, as evidenced by the nearly 1,000 military bases it has stationed around the world and the U.S.-led wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. If colonial Christianity failed to question colonialism, as Rieger contends, contemporary Christianity is even less able to scrutinize neo-colonialism, because we are unaware of its existence on a grand scale and how it shapes our mission. Neo-colonialism is more subtle than colonialism, but it is no less clear about its mission, meaning that we know what is right for the world, and no less powerful. Rieger drives from this point, quote, "While some of the problems of 19th century missions have been identified, especially as they relate to colonialism, its clear structures of power, there is very little critical reflection about the current situations of missions. The major book on the subject assumes that today, in a postmodern world, we are free to pursue new and creative missionary encounters that are no longer hampered by power differentials," close quote. Rieger raises this concern primarily about the current state of missions that the churches of the global North are conducting. However, his point is also relevant to the evangelical churches in the global South, since all contemporary missions, whether they stem from the global North or in the global South, are imbricated with the neo-colonial realities of the majority world. To put it differently, the question is not whether contemporary evangelical missions are involved in some form of neo-colonialism, but how and to what extent they are. Such involvement can range from active resistance or assistance, cooperation, participation in neo-colonial projects, to subtle yet vital or unintended resistance to neo-colonialism. Calling for a critical analysis of the relationship between contemporary evangelical missions and U.S. neo-colonialist militarism does not necessarily suggest that all evangelical missions unambiguously serve as ideological arms of neo-colonialism. Yet, failure to question U.S. neo-colonialism and its link to U.S. militarism can allow evangelical Christians to be complicit with U.S. imperial projects. Contemporary evangelical missions are mired within this complicated, messy, and volatile context. In the transnational social field of evangelical Christians, transnational connections are made through religious training, education, or exchange programs for missionaries and pastors, and are rooted in cultural, biblical, and theological references. Among these shared signifiers included, for example, imagining the world's end as the second coming of Christ, believing in the Great Commission according to the Gospel of Matthew, understanding Jerusalem to be the last post in worldwide evangelization, and focusing on the United States as a unique nation, indispensable in God's grand plan. In order to understand such transnational connections among evangelical Christians, I expand Katie Cannon's two cutting-edge concepts, missiology of imminent parousia and theology of racialized normativity. Although the topic to which Cannon applies these concepts is the transatlantic slave trade, her two critical concepts in relation to biblical, theological, and cultural references are helpful in exploring transnational connections among evangelical Christians regarding mission. The missiology of imminent parousia refers to the link created between biblical urgency and cultural reasoning that legitimates the mission strategies of cult Christian imperialists. Cannon argues that European expansionists coordinated Christian understanding of parousia, that is, quickly approaching expected hope of the return of Christ as judge to terminate this world order, with the Great Commission in their transatlantic human trafficking. Cannon's theology of racialized normativity refers to the constellation of structured white supremacy ideology. This concept highlights European expansionists' belief that their charitable acts of civilizing Africans would help the so-called, quote, barbarians grow up in their Eurocentric image, indoctrinating them in their worldviews, texts, and languages, close quote. Contemporary Christian overseas missions, especially those in so-called dangerous regions, can be said to stem from missiology of imminent parousia in conjunction with the Great Commission. Pastors and ministers constantly affirm and reaffirm through sermons, Bible studies, and online and offline networks that missions abroad are imperative. Offline networks that missions abroad are imperative in fulfilling the Great Commission. Mission activities in unsafe regions are thus understood as necessary steps of completing the Great Commission, and the risks and dangers they face in those regions are considered a form of persecution that the disciples of Christ must endure. The rhetoric of persecution has been powerful enough to mobilize evangelical Christians, fusing their view of persecuted contemporary Christians with images of early Christian martyrs under the Roman Empire. As Elizabeth Castelli demonstrates in her book Martyrdom and Memory, contemporary evangelical Christians often evoke and appropriate both the discourse and images of early Christian persecution and martyrdom. A statement made by senior pastor of Samuel Church echoes this view. After the hostage situation was over, leaving 2 members of his congregation dead, he stated, quote, "We believe that this is God's providence leading us to other Muslim countries. I don't want this to be a stumbling block for the missions," close quote. Firmly believing that God's plan for this world encompasses all the nations and all the people, evangelical Christians feel obligated to spread the gospel globally, even in places where Christian missions are banned. Their focus on some of these places that were believed to have partnered with the devil has shifted from communist countries to the Muslim world and other unreached regions. And in this process, the United States plays a crucial role in clearing the path that hindered mission activities. The United States has often been portrayed as a rescuer that can help and even save persecuted Christians around the world, whether in communist or in predominantly Muslim countries. As Glick Schuller indicates, evangelical Christians support special roles for certain states in the battle against evil, such as the United States and modern state of Israel, as evidence of God's plan come to fruition. In other words, transnational social networks of evangelical Christians validate the significance of one particular state, the United States, and legitimate modes of intervention that facilitate U.S. imperialism. Thus, it is not surprising that Korean evangelical Christians, both in Korea, let's see if we can see this map. It should be colorful, but so this is not surprising that Korean evangelical Christians, both in Korea and the U.S., who in general represent a strong pro-America faction, view the United States as good and support its foreign policy, whether it is about North Korea or Iraq, because they confidently believe that what the United States does will eventually be justified as part of the larger struggle against evil. So you see the U.S. Flag and Korean flag go hand in hand together. Like the missiologic of imminent parousia, the theologic of racialized normativity also illuminates certain aspects of transnational evangelical missions. Unlike the methods of 19th century Western missions, the models, methods, and projects of contemporary evangelical missions are considered more sensitive to the so-called receiving cultures or mission fields. While professional missionaries conduct most long-term missions, non-professional missionaries, so-called lay people, often carry out short-term missions by providing medical assistance or educational opportunities to potential converts. Unlike previous mission models, many contemporary mission projects are geared toward these so-called humanitarian aid or development aid projects, which are staffed by people who offer tangible results to local residents. Missionaries believe that these short-term mission activities improve the living conditions of people of the mission fields and further bring development within the receiving countries. Despite the missionaries' seemingly harmless intentions, both short-term and long-term mission activities might serve to reinscribe neo-colonial realities. For instance, Rieger cautions that the well-meaning plans that promote the development of other countries or that call for social programs are based on missionaries' assumptions of the inferiority of the other. He also notes that even such well-meaning notions as inculturation of the Gospels in foreign cultures that are often promoted by more progressive missionaries circles are based on the assumption that acculturation has already been accomplished at home. Rieger further argues that this hidden sense of superiority has an oppressive effect, even without colonies or the traditional kind of empire where the rulers pull all the strings. Economic and cultural structures are sufficient to maintain the differentials of power, and those structures continue to reinforce even our most benevolent moves. Missionaries, for example, may undoubtedly have good intentions of helping and saving those suffering others to whom they proselytize explicitly or implicitly, especially underprivileged women and children. And certainly, the South Korean missionaries in Afghanistan did not overtly or even consciously intended to promote American cultural norms, lifestyles, behaviors, and worldviews by teaching English in the same ways that European colonizers tried to implement European lifestyles, worldviews, languages, and belief systems in their colonies. Yet, the teaching of English to Afghan children by Korean Christian missionaries for whom English is not a native language warrants the question, to what extent do evangelical Christians' mission activities promote so-called American values? John Henry Clark's statement rings true, quote, "In the 15th and 16th century, Europeans not only colonized most of the world, they colonized the information about the world. They developed a monopoly control over concepts and images," close quote. According to Rieger, new Protestant mission projects in 19th century Latin America focused on education, including, quote, "not only academic subjects, but also teaching of discipline and manners, and perhaps also more important, the study of English," close quote. Whereas the Christian churches of 15th and 16th century became the handmaiden of European world domination, as Clark noted, 19th century Protestant new mission projects spread so-called American values, as Rieger argues. Then, what about contemporary missions in the global South that are situated in the context of U.S. neocolonialism and militarism? No matter how well-intended mission goals and activities are, missionaries become entangled in a web of neocolonialism when they carry out mission projects with the deeper or hidden goal of spreading the gospel to people in regions such as the current US-led war zones and the regions in the 1040 windows. The late feminist theologian Lady Russell viewed the Great Commission as creating a global Christian empire, noting that, quote, "These words from Matthew about going to teach, preach, and baptize in Jesus' name echo the imperial Roman practice of expansion to the ends of the earth and have been used by colonial empires ever since to justify colonization, domination, and forced conversion to Christianity," close quote. When South Korean missionaries traveled to war-torn regions like Afghanistan or other unreached regions to save oppressed women and children, they, along with other Christians who provide both tangible and intangible support back home, participate in building a global Christian empire and legitimate U.S. imperialist military interventions that have justified a war in defense of our way of life. This complicity becomes clear when we recognize the significant role the U.S. plays in transnational evangelical network and the predominant theological position on Islam as a force to overcome rather than as a partner vital in maintaining peaceful coexistence on this planet. The collusion became even more obvious with the Bush administration's proclamation that countries were either with us or against us. However, as Glick Schuller claims, every form of imperialist intervention is fraught with contradictions from which people can learn. And indeed, the mission activities of churches in the Global South reveal, perhaps most poignantly in the 2007 South Korean hostage incident, that the relationship between missions and imperialist interventions is never without contradiction. Evangelical Christians in South Korea may have supported the dispatch of South Korean troops to Afghanistan in support of the U.S. military effort, for they, like many other evangelical Christians, perceive U.S. as nation chosen by God to fight against evil for freedom, democracy, and human rights. Evangelical churches may also have adopted the U.S. language of necessary war against evil, which includes both spiritual and territorial conquest in their missions. Yet, the South Korean missionaries kidnapped in Afghanistan may have also learned that they do not necessarily have transnational influence necessary within the transnational social field of evangelical Christians to elicit a reciprocal response from the U.S. government. Their lives were not, in fact, considered important enough for the U.S. government to get involved in negotiating a release or for the U.S. military to risk sending troops in to attempt to rescue them. Firmly restating its own policy of not negotiating with terrorists, the U.S. government was invisible during the hostage incident, making no gesture at a rescue effort, nor supporting the South Korean government's direct negotiations with the Taliban. This situation illuminates one contradiction in the U.S. military effort in Afghanistan. That is, the United States will not necessarily protect or even try to rescue endangered citizens of an allied nation, while at the same time demanding their sacrifice in the name of friendship. The fierce debates that took place in South Korea over who was responsible for the hostage situation in Afghanistan also revealed a variety of problems that have resulted from U.S.-led wars. These together may help people realize the huge price so-called allies pay in assisting U.S. imperial projects. People who understand this imbalance may be better able to mobilize collective power at the grassroots to resist further requests from U.S. administration to send South Korean troops to Afghanistan, Iraq, or any other places. Recognizing the unequal relationship between the United States and its less powerful allies may allow people to find different ways of engaging the world's sole superpower so that they might avoid violence in the future. The 16 South Korean female missionaries who went to Afghanistan on the shorter mission may also reveal contradictions or cracks in the U.S. military effort in unexpected ways. For instance, despite the possibility that evangelical churches can now appropriate the story of South Korean women's persecution during captivity to facilitate their evangelical mission, the women's experience that could have been different from the captured men's experience in Afghanistan may help Christian churches rethink their missions. The 16 female missionaries may help others see the brutal consequences of the current war based on what they witnessed and experienced as female hostages in Afghanistan who were kept separated from male hostages for the most of the time. Those women may help others see how they can really assist Afghan women and children whose living conditions have deteriorated as a result of the US-led war and whose needs certainly cannot be met neither by a few short-term mission trips nor by increasing the number of US and allied troops on the ground. Another issue that comes out of these female missionaries' involvement in this particular mission case is that they, along with other female missionaries from the Global South, defy the image of what white evangelicals call the new paradigmatic Christian, meaning that a poor and brown third world female. Evangelical women in the Global South as mission agents are now carrying out tasks that have been monopolized by Christian white middle-class elite women. The South Korean women's participation in the saving mission is not exactly the same as white evangelical women's project of saving poor brown women within the framework of Western colonized legacy. However, South Korean women saving poor brown women as brown women remains to be seen whether they carried out their missionary work as neo-colonial elites of a post-colonial nation complicit with the US imperial project. At the same time, South Korean women's increasing participation in overseas missions also begs the question of whether this actually indicates that women who have been struggling for gender equality in Korean churches have resorted to overseas mission fields where they can exercise a certain degree of leadership without direct or heavy-handed supervision of sending churches or organizations. Whether positive outcomes might emanate from the 2007 hostage crisis in Afghanistan remains to be seen. But the cracks, ambiguities, and contradictions that the situation reveals should, at the very least, make people who have been supportive of U.S. military efforts reconsider ongoing imperialist military operations, as well as contemporary evangelical missions in and from the Global South. This is especially crucial when evangelical missions in from the Global South tend to grow without the benefit of much serious internal critique. Without collective self-reflection, Christian missions in the Global South will not escape the ignominy of reinscribing of neo-colonial realities, but only maintain, if not worsen, the already bleak living conditions of the majority of people living in the Global South and on the margins of the empire. Mark Louis Taylor's suggestion can resonate with those who wish to look at mission more critically, though he mainly addresses U.S. evangelicals. Reflecting on the legacy of Billy Graham, Taylor suggests that U.S. evangelicals, quote, renounce the organized intention to convert non-Christians, close quote. But he adds, this would not necessarily mean, quote, renouncing all notions of the Missio Dei, but it would be a view of mission as a witness born on the other side of that renunciation, close quote. It is, however, questionable whether conservative Christians from the Global South would be willing to renounce the organized intention to convert non-Christians, when in fact, they have adopted some major strategies for overseas missions from the so-called colonizing churches of the West by reinscribing the similar colonizing mindset and work. Yet if they would, under what circumstances would they be willing to renounce such intention? Ongoing critical scrutiny of overseas missions in and from the Global South seems necessary and even urgent without overlooking power differences among evangelical Christians in the Global North and in the Global South, because decolonization and the decolonized Christianity is necessary for both groups of Christians. Thank you. Well, I had a few more maps that I wanted to show you, but I'm sorry. I don't know what had happened.
We have a few minutes here for questions, and I'll let Dr. Kim field your questions.
Yes.
You talk about global Christianity and world Christianity. If you can, in a nutshell, give me at least a couple of things that make them different and not the same.
Global Christianity, what I refer to in my papers, is actually defined by Philip Jenkins. And he says global Christianity is like a new Christendom. So what will happen in the future of Christianity will complicate the world in a more worse way. So based on Samuel Huntington's thesis of the clash of civilization, so Christianity of the new Christendom and Islam, on the other side, will clash. So the world will, become disastrous. So that's basically how he foresees the future of global Christianity. On the other hand, Lamin Saneh and Peter Fan see that world Christianity does not necessarily carry the baggage of old Christendom. They are the responses, indigenous responses to the Christianity growing in the global south. So Saneh and Fan actually criticize Philip Jenkins' thesis. But I agree with Saneh and Fan, basically. However, I also diverge from their point of world Christianity, arguing that world Christianity is not just indigenous responses to the global global south. It's much more complicated. We have to see these transnational connections as well as indigenous responses to that. Hopefully I answered. Yes. Yes.
There's currently, I think it's the 10th Assembly of the World Council of Churches is taking place in Busan, even as we, of course, they're probably sleeping right now.
Yes.
But one of the things that highlighted the first day was a fairly significant protest from evangelical South Korean Christians against the World Council of Churches. Would you care to comment on how that may fit into your presentation, or if it does?
I would include conservative evangelical Christians in Korea who are currently protesting WCC as part of transnational the social field of evangelical Christians. And they are very zealous about overseas missions. They are against LGBTQ, and they are against any interfaith dialogue. So basically, yeah, so that's why they are protesting LGBT as well as the interfaith dialogue, pretty much. And they are the group who are really, really zealous about overseas missions.
You said something about, I was wondering about the impact of neocolonialism, and you connected it, or I connected it with imperialistic intervention. I know of the history, like from my own culture, the impact, some of the impact of the slave trade. Have you had a chance to look at the impact today on people in the cultures that you're talking about, the indigenous cultures, for example? How are the people being affected, or how would they be affected by neocolonialism?
It's a very important question and very big question. So the ways in which people are, affected by neocolonialism can go on and on and on. So, for example, some theologians I've quoted say that the impact may not that visible compared to the impact that colonialism have made, but it doesn't mean that people are not affected by the neo-colonial realities. Actually, it can be more serious. I don't know, I cannot make any like a quantitative comparison per se, but ways in which neo-colonialism has affected people in the global south is actually pretty brutal.
So we have to look for it differently.
Yes, I
Yeah.
think so. Oh, and the thing I didn't mention in my presentation is that Korea, South Korea is no longer the second missionary sending country. So US is still the first, and the second missionary sending country is actually Brazil. And Korea was pushed back to number 6, and India is between Brazil and Korea. And another interesting data that came out this year is that if we look at data differently, so if we look at the missionary sending country based on per 1 million Christians, actually surprisingly, Palestine is number 1 missionary sending country. And Korea, with that new calculation, ranked 5th. So Palestine is followed by Ireland and Samoa and some other, countries from the global south. But that's new data, which I didn't have, chance to include in my presentation. Yes.
When you talk about missionary sending, is that a transnational thing only, or is that within one's own country as well?
Yes, it should include sending missionaries within their own territories as well, but my focus is more overseas, which requires, heavy travel.
Okay.
Yes.
So how are these missionaries from the global south received when they come into other regions of the world, particularly in the north?
I think people in the audience can possibly answer that question. Well, from the north perspective, are you talking about north?
Yes, when they come to the places that see themselves as the repositories of Christianity, how are these missionaries received? What is their experience?
To be honest, I don't know. I think one of you should study that, how people in the global north actually receive that, right? I think it would be interesting, study subject, definitely. And I also noted in my article that was already published that the limit of my study is that I didn't, obviously didn't have chance to speak with Afghan women and children who receive, missionaries from whether global north or global south, how they experience those missionaries. So that's, obviously the limits of my study, which requires field study as well. But I don't think I can really answer to your question, but I think it will be really interesting to look at how people actually receive missionaries from the global south, from communities in the global north. Yes.
I just had a clarification question, if I could. There's a point in your presentation that you talked about third world churches showing up in the countries that they go to that they perceive to be a mission field. So in identifying them that way, once they're in that geopolitical space, what is it that constitutes them as a third world church? Is it that how they perceive themselves as only being there temporarily, or that they have come from a place that's labeled as third world? Because I wonder how that then comes in tension with other kind of figures in the imaginary, like the forever foreigner and things like that, to call them third world churches.
Right, I think I quote a person who talks about third world once. In that quote, the author definitely talks about missionaries who are coming from so-called third world countries. And now the term global south and the majority world have replaced the term third world. But people still tend to use all those terms interchangeably. But I think your question is really important. But
So is there a point that they're no longer considered like a third world church or community?
I think depending on how you maintain connection with the churches in your third world countries. Some maintain same denomination structure with their so-called mother church, and some may change their denomination affiliation in this context. So I think it all varies depending on how you continue your relationship with churches in so-called motherland. But oftentimes, so-called third world churches who start new church or new ministry here, tend to continue relationship with their motherland churches.
I don't really know how to phrase this question. I just watched something or read an article the other day about how the map that we've all grown up with is essentially very wrong because it showed, and then it was like linked to a clip from the West Wing where they're trying to get a new map to be used where it shows Africa as its relative size and how most of the other countries can fit inside the size of Africa, and then it flips the global south to the north, and Allison Janney's character is like, well, you can't do that. That freaks me out. And the characters were talking about how we've all grown up with this is the way the world is. And so, like, I still need to do some research on how accurate the new map is. But is the way we look at the world, like, does that play a lot into it? And I was sort of thinking about your question, like, is there this almost hierarchy, like, well, we're on the north and you're on the south, and so, like, how big a part does that play in the global mission world?
I'm not sure if I can really respond to that. Yeah, so I don't think I can respond to that. But one thing you mentioned about so-called we are the north and you are the south, that's one critique that gets the term global south and global north gets actually. It's, yeah, how can you say what is, I mean, of course, the European countries, the Western European countries and North America, and primarily due to those two reasons, the global north is named after those regions, and global south are basically the rest. But definitely that's the limits of that term. So I think any terminology or categorization has its own limits, and we have to continue to question who defines, who categorizes certain things, and what's the limits of certain categories or terminologies if we still have to use, any terminology or categories. So, yeah, it's an ongoing task, I think.
And the function of a map is to categorize.
Yeah,
I mean,
definitely.
each one serves a purpose.
So studying, right. So studying geography, it now becomes very critical study.
And studying how we see geography.
Definitely.
Yeah. It's not whether it's a plateau or not.
Right, it's not given. It's not natural, right?
Well, it's beyond the natural confines. It's all the imposed structure on the natural structure.
Yeah. But thanks for asking the question.
Okay, well, thank you all for coming, and I'd like to thank Dr. Kim. This is a great conversation, especially in this very rapidly changing landscape that we're living in, especially in theological circles. And I know she's, I think, one person in theology is really bringing in the idea of decolonial and coloniality into this, and of course, and U.S. militarism, which not many theologians are actually, looking into. So.
And yeah, thanks for the opportunity. I really enjoyed your questions. I didn't expect that I'd get this many questions. So thank you for listening, and thanks for asking wonderful questions.